At the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, where powerful waves crashed against ancient shores, a conflict began that would change the course of history forever. It was a war built on faith, ambition, survival, and the hunger for control. Thousands of men crossed the ocean believing they were fighting for something greater than themselves, but many would never return to tell their stories. The kingdoms involved wanted land, wealth, influence, and power over one of the most important coastlines in the world. For generations, the true story of this struggle remained hidden beneath old maps, forgotten records, and the memories of those who witnessed it. But when we look closer, a question appears. Was this really a battle between enemies who hated each other? Or was it a much larger fight for control of a changing world? Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story begins with a man named Thomas Whitmore, a young sailor who believed the Atlantic was more than just an endless ocean. To him, it was a road leading toward opportunity. Like many men of his time, Thomas heard stories about distant shores filled with valuable resources and powerful kingdoms. He dreamed of becoming part of something historic, but what he did not understand was that every journey across those waters came with danger. The Atlantic was not empty. It was already a world of powerful rulers, skilled warriors, and communities that had protected their lands for centuries. When ships from distant nations arrived, they did not simply bring new ideas and trade. They brought competition, suspicion, and the beginning of conflicts that would spread across the coastline. Far away from Thomas, another figure named William Carter served as a military commander who understood the importance of the Atlantic coast. William knew that controlling a single port could change the future of an entire kingdom. A port meant trade, trade meant money, money meant armies could grow stronger. This was why every coastline became valuable. Every harbor became a prize. Every ship arriving from across the ocean represented either an opportunity or a threat. The rulers who controlled these areas were not willing to surrender their influence easily. They had built their power over generations, and they knew that losing control of the coast could mean losing everything. The world at this time was changing rapidly. Nations were expanding, explorers were searching for new routes, and leaders were making decisions that would affect millions of people. The Atlantic became the center of a massive struggle where different forces collided. Some claimed they were fighting for religion. Others claimed they were protecting their homeland. Many wanted wealth and influence. The truth was that every side had its own reasons, and those reasons would lead ordinary men into extraordinary situations. Soldiers who had once lived peaceful lives found themselves standing on battlefields. Sailors who once dreamed of adventure found themselves trapped in dangerous missions. Families waited by the shore, wondering if their loved ones would ever return. As tensions increased, Thomas Whitmore began to realize that the stories he had heard about the Atlantic were incomplete. The ocean was not simply a path to discovery. It was a place where powerful groups fought for dominance. Every voyage carried secrets, every agreement carried risks, and every victory created new enemies. The people involved believed they understood the world around them, but the events that followed would prove that the Atlantic had become the stage for a conflict much larger than anyone imagined. William Carter watched these changes from the center of the growing military struggle. He studied maps, followed reports from distant shores, and prepared his forces for what he believed was coming. But even he could not predict how quickly the situation would change. A single decision made by leaders thousands of miles away would push the region closer to war. A choice made in a royal chamber would eventually affect sailors, soldiers, merchants, and families across the Atlantic coast. And then came the moment that transformed tension into open conflict. A fleet appeared on the horizon. The arrival of those ships would become the beginning of a chapter filled with battles, alliances, betrayals, and consequences that would last for generations. Because once the first shots were fired, there would be no easy way back. At the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, there was a time when the sound of waves carried more than the rhythm of nature. Those waters carried the echoes of battles, the ambitions of kings, and the stories of men who crossed the unknown believing they were changing history. This was a world where a ship appearing on the horizon could bring hope, fear, wealth, or destruction. The Atlantic was no longer just an endless barrier separating distant lands. It had become a battlefield where powerful forces competed for control. For centuries, kingdoms looked toward the ocean with dreams of expansion. They saw opportunities beyond the horizon, lands filled with resources, trade routes that could transform nations, and territories that could increase their influence. But every journey across those waters came with a price. The same ships that carried explorers and merchants also carried soldiers, weapons, and the ambitions of rulers who wanted more than discovery. They wanted dominance. This is the forgotten story of the conflict known as the War of the Infidels in the coast of Atlantic, a struggle where faith, gold, and power collided. It was a period when different civilizations met under uncertain circumstances, when alliances were created and broken, and when ordinary people became trapped inside a conflict controlled by powerful leaders. Among those caught in this changing world was Thomas Whitmore, a sailor whose journey across the Atlantic would reveal a reality far different from the stories he had heard. Like many young men of his generation, Thomas believed the ocean represented a chance for a better future. He imagined distant shores, new opportunities, and the possibility of becoming part of something remembered for generations. But the Atlantic held another truth. The ocean was already surrounded by powerful communities with their own histories, traditions, and goals. The people living along those coasts were not waiting for someone to discover them. They had built cities, developed trade networks, and protected their lands long before foreign ships arrived. Thomas would soon learn that the arrival of new powers did not simply create friendships and partnerships, it created competition. Every port became valuable, every trade route became a target, every decision made by a distant ruler could change the lives of thousands of people. And standing at the center of this growing conflict was William Carter, a military commander who understood that the future would belong to whoever controlled the Atlantic coastline. William studied the movement of fleets, the strength of rival kingdoms, and the importance of strategic locations along the shore. To him, the coastline was more than land. It was the key to power, but William also knew something that many others ignored. Wars rarely begin with a single battle. They begin with small decisions. A broken agreement, a fight over resources, a leader refusing to surrender, a ship arriving at the wrong moment. Slowly, the tension across the Atlantic began to grow. What started as competition over trade and influence became something far more dangerous. Religious differences became part of the conflict. Leaders used beliefs to unite their followers and justify their actions, but behind every speech and every declaration was another question. Who would truly benefit from this war, the soldiers fighting on the coastline, the sailors risking their lives on the ocean, or the powerful figures sitting far away making decisions that others had to pay for? The answer would become clearer as the conflict expanded, because this was not only a war between armies, it was a struggle between visions of the future. One side saw the Atlantic as a gateway to opportunity. Another saw it as a threat that needed to be resisted. And between them stood thousands of people whose lives would be changed forever. The stories passed down through generations often focused on the winners, the kings, the commanders, the explorers whose names appeared in history books, but hidden beneath those stories were the voices of ordinary people, the fishermen who watched foreign ships arrive, the families who waited for soldiers who never returned, the sailors who entered dangerous waters believing they were chasing a dream, and the warriors who discovered that the battle they entered was much bigger than they ever expected. As the first major confrontations approached, both sides believed they understood their enemies, but the Atlantic had a way of revealing the truth, and when the final chapter of this conflict unfolded, it would reshape the Atlantic forever. To understand how this conflict began, we have to return to a time when the Atlantic coast was not just a place on a map, but the center of a world changing before people's eyes. It was a meeting point where powerful kingdoms, ambitious rulers, skilled sailors, and wealthy traders all crossed paths. The Atlantic connected different worlds, but it also created competition between them. European kingdoms were expanding their reach. Their leaders wanted new trade routes, valuable resources, and greater influence across distant lands. They believed controlling the ocean meant controlling the future. Every expedition sent across the Atlantic carried hopes of discovery, but it also carried the expectations of powerful people who wanted results. At the same time, African coastal kingdoms had already built strong societies with established trade networks, valuable resources, and strategic locations. These regions were not unknown lands waiting to be claimed. They were places with their own rulers, traditions, and ambitions. The arrival of foreign ships introduced a new challenge. How would these powerful societies respond when outside forces began seeking control? For Thomas Whitmore, the sailor who once viewed the Atlantic as a path toward opportunity, the reality became much more complicated. The distant shores he dreamed of reaching were not empty. They were already filled with people defending their homes, their wealth, and their way of life. And for William Carter, the military commander watching the situation unfold, the importance of the Atlantic coast became impossible to ignore. He understood that whoever controlled the ports and sea routes would gain an advantage that could influence entire nations. The ocean was becoming the greatest battlefield of its time. But as more ships arrived, something began to change. Trade, which had once connected different communities, slowly became a competition for control. Agreements became fragile, partnerships became uncertain, and exploration became a race where every kingdom wanted to be the first to claim power. The leaders involved often spoke about faith and defending their beliefs. They described their actions as necessary struggles between opposing sides, but behind those powerful speeches were questions that many people quietly asked. Was this truly a holy war, or was religion being used to support a much larger fight for wealth and influence? Who were the real enemies? Were they the soldiers standing on opposite sides of the battlefield, or were they the powerful leaders who pushed ordinary people into a conflict they did not fully understand? As tensions increased, Thomas Whitmore began seeing the difference between the stories told in royal halls and the reality experienced by those living through the conflict. Men who sailed across the Atlantic were promised honor and opportunity, but many found themselves facing uncertainty, danger, and decisions that would change their lives forever. William Carter also discovered that controlling the Atlantic would require more than military strength. It required strategy, alliances, and understanding the movements of every rival power. One mistake could destroy years of planning. The Atlantic had become a giant chessboard. Every ship was a move. Every battle was a message. Every victory changed the balance of power. And as the struggle grew, one question remained unanswered. Who truly started this war? Was it the rulers searching for expansion, the commanders preparing their armies, the explorers chasing new opportunities, or was it a conflict that became unavoidable the moment powerful worlds collided? Because the answer would reveal something much deeper about the War of the Infidels in the coast of Atlantic. This was never just a battle over land. It was a battle over who would decide the future of the Atlantic world. When the fighting finally slowed, the Atlantic coast was no longer the same place it had been before the conflict began. The battles had ended in some areas, but the effects remained everywhere. The ports that once represented opportunity now carried memories of destruction. Fortresses that once stood as symbols of strength became reminders of the price of war. Cities had fallen, trade routes had shifted, and thousands of lives had been affected. For Thomas Whitmore, the dream that brought him across the ocean had changed completely. He had arrived believing the Atlantic was a place where men could find opportunity and create new futures. Instead, he witnessed how quickly ambition could turn into conflict. The ocean that once represented discovery had become a witness to loss, sacrifice, and the struggle for control. William Carter also saw the cost of the decisions made during the war. Victory came with consequences that could not be measured only by territory gained or battles won. Every choice made by commanders affected families, communities, and generations that followed. But the biggest change was invisible. The war changed how the world viewed the Atlantic. It was no longer just an ocean separating distant lands. It became a highway of power. The leaders who understood the importance of the Atlantic understood that controlling its waters meant influencing the future. Ships could carry armies, resources, ideas, and wealth across enormous distances. Whoever controlled the movement across the ocean held an advantage unlike anything the world had seen before. The conflict between powerful forces had revealed something important. The Atlantic was not an empty space between civilizations. It was a connection point where the future of nations could be decided. The stories of the war were filled with commanders, explorers, and rulers, but the true impact was felt by the people who lived through it. The fishermen, traders, sailors, and families who watched their world change around them. Thomas Whitmore's journey showed that the ocean could create dreams, but it could also expose the dangers hidden behind those dreams. William Carter's experience showed that winning a battle did not always mean controlling the outcome of history. Because the Atlantic conflict was about more than who captured a port or defeated an enemy. It was about the beginning of a new era, an era where oceans became pathways for influence, where distant lands became connected by ambition, and where the struggle for control of the Atlantic would continue shaping the world long after the final battles ended. The greatest battles were not always fought on the battlefield. Some of the most important victories happened far away from the sound of cannons and the movement of armies. They happened through influence, through economics, through control of information and the ability to shape how the world understood the conflict. As time passed, it became clear that the War of the Infidels in the coast of Atlantic was never only about the battles that took place along the shoreline. The fighting was only one part of a much larger struggle. The real contest was about who would have the power to decide what happened next. Thomas Whitmore slowly realized that the journey he began as an explorer had placed him inside a historic transformation. The Atlantic was becoming the center of a new world order. The ships crossing those waters were not only carrying soldiers and supplies, they were carrying the ambitions of kingdoms, the plans of rulers, and the future of nations. William Carter understood the same reality from a different perspective. He saw that military victories could change borders, but influence could change history. A kingdom could lose a battle and still survive, but losing control of trade, resources, and connections across the ocean could weaken its power for generations. The people fighting on the shorelines were part of a much bigger struggle, a struggle between expanding powers, a struggle over resources, a struggle over who would shape the future of the Atlantic world. Many of the soldiers and sailors involved believed they were fighting for a single cause. They believed they understood their mission. But history revealed that the conflict had many layers. Behind the flags, behind the speeches, and behind the battles were decisions that affected millions of people who never stepped onto a battlefield. The war changed the way nations looked at oceans. The Atlantic was no longer seen as a distant challenge to overcome. It became a pathway to power, connection, and influence. The same waters that carried explorers searching for opportunity would later carry the movement of entire economies and global ambitions. And this is why the story of Thomas Whitmore, William Carter, and the War of the Infidels in the coast of Atlantic remains important. Because the conflict was never only about who won a battle, it was about who controlled the future. And the decisions made during that era would continue influencing the world for generations to come. Today, the Atlantic looks peaceful. The waves move quietly across the same waters where fleets once traveled with hidden intentions. Tourists walk along its beaches. Ships cross its surface every day carrying goods, people, and stories from one side of the world to another. But beneath those waves are memories of ambition, conflict, and survival, memories of men like Thomas Whitmore, who crossed the ocean searching for opportunity but discovered a world shaped by struggle. Memories of commanders like William Carter, who believed strategy and strength could determine the future, only to learn that history is shaped by forces much larger than any single person. The people who lived through the War of the Infidels in the coast of Atlantic believed they understood what they were fighting for. Some believed they were protecting their faith, some believed they were defending their homes, Some believed they were creating a better future. But as time passed, many discovered that they were part of something much larger, a struggle that involved kingdoms, economies, and the future direction of the world. The greatest lesson from this forgotten conflict is that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Behind every battle are human stories. Behind every victory are sacrifices. And behind every decision made by powerful leaders are ordinary people who carry the consequences. The Atlantic was once a place where different worlds met. It became a battlefield, then it became a pathway that connected those same worlds forever. And perhaps the biggest question still remains, was this truly a war of beliefs or was it always a war for power? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this journey into one of history's forgotten conflicts, subscribe for more stories about the events that shaped the world.